It's been almost a year since we lost our beautiful baby girl, Abigail. She would have been 5 next week. You hear all the time about how kids go missing from shopping carts, from the fair, or at the park. But it creates a sickening feeling of violation and helplessness when your child is taken from your own home. Are they ever really safe? We've been too emotionally gone to be staying at our house in New Mexico. So we decided to stay with my mother in Missouri for a while. But to celebrate our daughter's birthday, my wife thought it would be a great idea to go back to our property and just spend some time there, her and I. So we packed our things and headed to New Mexico. We finally arrived, and it's almost strange how little things have changed around our property, even inside the house. You would think, it being New Mexico, there would be more dust, but there wasn't even a speck. Our house is on a small plot of land, in a 2-square-mile unit. There are less than 10 other people living in the area, and it's mostly surrounded by mesa. People come out here for the quiet and the safety that the desert offers. Everyone who buys land knows that they have to build their own structures, so not one house is the same as another. After we brought in our bags, I volunteered to go into town for supplies, while my wife rested a bit. She always seems to get really nauseous after long drives. She accepted without protest, and I began my 45-minute drive to town. The first thing I did when I got to town was stop at the local gas station. The price seemed pretty low, and I was friends with the owner anyway. "Hey, Toby." The look on his face was priceless.
John, it's so good to see you. What brings you back to these parts? How's Rose?
Rose is good. The long drive got to her, though. We're here for Abby's birthday. His facial expression changed.
Oh man, I didn't realize it was that time already. How are you holding up?
I'm good. My wife and I seem to finally be at peace. We're ready to move on and start the next chapter in our lives.
That's great to hear.
Hey, how's Sherry? Sherry is one of our closest neighbors. She lives about a quarter mile from our house. Rose adores her.
Things have changed around here, man.
His face grew hard. What do you mean?
After you left, everyone else seemed to follow. The unit is almost empty now. A lot of people sold their plots. I bought a few myself. Others seemed to just leave.
Who is left? He smiled.
I think it's just you, me, and that old hermit, George.
Do you think Abby's disappearance had anything to do with them leaving?
No, nothing like that. It was a bad year for rain, and a lot of folks just couldn't handle driving to town for water every week.
After a little more small talk, I filled up the tank and we said our goodbyes. After I had gotten everything I thought we would need, I headed for the post office, knowing I'd only get ads and bills. I was surprised to find more than a few letters of condolence from friends and family, dated to about a year ago. There was a letter on the very bottom of the stack, with no return address. I opened it. Mr. and Mrs. H. I regret to inform you that your property deed has been suspended due to unpaid taxes. You have 3 months to get your affairs in order and exit said property before it's repossessed by the state. If you have any questions or wish to contact us, please call using the information listed below. Thank you. Immediately I had my doubts that the letter was legit. Not only have all of our taxes been paid, we would certainly have received previous notice. Just to be sure, I made a quick call to the number that was listed in the letter. There was no answer, and no voicemail. I decided I would go to the town clerk tomorrow, just to be safe. It was already after hours, so I didn't bother calling. On my way home, all of a sudden, the engine light came on. I swore out loud, but wasn't all that surprised, considering the mileage we just put on our truck. My wife would not be too happy. This is the nicest car we've owned. When I got to the unit, I passed George's house and saw him just as he was heading inside. He turned to me, and I waved, happy to see the man still kicking. He just glared at me and slammed his door shut. Rude, I thought to myself, but ruled it out as him just hoping we were gone for good. He considers the whole mesa his. My wife and I had finally changed the sheets on the bed and started to lay down. Suddenly, there was a very loud pounding noise on the window in the bathroom. Very startled and somewhat annoyed, I stormed into the bathroom to see what was going on, and it just stopped. I was on my way back to bed when I caught out of the corner of my eye a black figure with some strange hat on pass by the window above the kitchen sink. As I ran over, the pounding in the bathroom started again. My wife was freaked out, and I was pissed. I ran into the mudroom and turned on the outside light. Telling my wife to check the window in the kitchen, I went back into the bathroom. It was that damn figure again. As he or she ran away, I could see a straw hat. What the hell? Was this some kind of hillbilly prank? Just in case, I loaded my gun and slept with it next to the bed that night. I had just left the house to see the clerk about the eviction notice when I saw George outside his house again. I raised my hand to wave, but noticed he was wearing that damn straw hat from last night. In a furious rage, I slammed on the brakes and ran out of the truck. What in the hell do you think you're doing snooping around my yard late at night, trying to scare my wife and I like that? We've done nothing wrong to you, and I suggest you leave us alone before I do something about this. I screamed at him, and he deserved it. I wanted to punch him. He just looked at me with his usual George glare and didn't say a word. That's what I thought, you fucking hermit. I made my way back to the truck and headed to the clerk. I put on some music to clear my mind. When I unmuted the radio, it automatically switched to a CD and started playing something by David Bowie. I didn't recognize the song. Some of the lyrics were, I slash them cold, I kill them dead, I broke the gooks, I cracked their heads, I'll bomb them out from under the beds. At this point I actually chuckled. The fact that George even knew enough about electronics to be able to do this to my car was actually funny to me. The reaction I got out of him today was enough for me to know that he wouldn't be around again. I ejected the CD and threw it out the window. I know, what a litter bug. If my wife were here, she would have yelled at me. In the moment, I was feeling too manly to care. The clerk confirmed my suspicions and said that the letter I received was never sent out by the State Department and that my taxes were in fact all caught up. She kept the letter and told me that if anything further were to come in the mail, to contact her immediately. I dismissed it as a prank and thought nothing more of it. No sign of George. It looks like he left after I let him have it. Good. This is my mesa. I smiled at myself. When I pulled into our plot, the lights in the house were all off. The door was wide open, and the window above the sink had been smashed. I ran in immediately to find my wife unconscious on the floor, with a big bruise on her head. Whatever she was cooking was now completely burnt and on fire. I threw the whole pan in the sink and laid my wife down on the couch, putting an ice pack from the freezer on her head. George, I'm going to kill him. No one messes with my wife. The house is one thing, but not my wife. I tripped over a rock while pacing back and forth. That's what had hit her, and what had smashed the window. There was a note attached to the rock. I picked it up, shaking with anger. On the note was just one sloppily written word: leave. When my wife regained consciousness, she told me she hadn't seen anyone. I put her in the bed to rest and made her some soup. I then headed over to George's with my gun. He better pray to God for mercy, because I won't be showing him any. I kicked open his door and screamed, "You better fucking run, George!" I scanned the room and stopped in my tracks when I saw the blood streak on the floor. I searched the whole house, and he wasn't there. My anger slowly grew into confusion and worry. I wasn't actually going to hurt the poor guy, just scare him into leaving us alone. The blood streak looked almost like someone had dragged him out of the house. I dropped my gun off at home, filled my wife in on my findings, and called the police. I spent most of the evening at George's house, explaining the letter in the mail, George pounding on my windows, the CD, my poor wife, and the blood. The officer said that they couldn't do anything about the situation until they found the body. Cops, always so useless. I was on my way home, ready to call it a night, when my engine started making some horrible noises. I remembered the engine light and scolded myself for not getting it looked at sooner. Tomorrow was Abigail's birthday. We decided to head into town for the cake and candles. We checked our mail and picked up the cake. Since there were no more mysterious letters, we got in the truck and started the long drive home. About 5 minutes from our road, the truck suddenly stalled. Knowing what my wife's reaction would be, I didn't even bother to look at her. I popped the hood open, and our engine was smoking. We called a tow truck, and the guy was nice enough to drop us off at the end of our road. I carried the cake for the 1.5 mile walk. Thankfully, it wasn't quite dark when we got home. When I walked in, I nearly dropped the cake. Someone had spray painted the entire wall in our living room with the word "leave" over and over again. I stayed up late, painting over the walls while my wife slept. I decided to get up early the next morning and report this to the police before it came time for Abby's cake. When I woke, my wife was already up and dressed. "What are you doing up already, sweetheart?" "I'm coming with you. I don't feel safe here alone anymore." I agreed, and we began walking to the bus stop, not too far from the end of our road. When we got to town, I couldn't help but notice the alarming amount of police cars and crime scene tape at Toby's gas station. Worried about Toby, we got off the bus and I ran over to the nearest officer, asking him what was going on. He just told me to step back and that the situation was under control. I stood and watched for a few minutes, but couldn't see anything. My wife and I were so confused. She wanted to get a coffee before we headed to the police station. We got to the local coffee spot and picked a booth way in the corner. I grabbed us both the morning paper, and the waitress brought us our coffee. I was startled by the sound of my wife's mug shattering on the floor. She couldn't speak, and tears began forming in her eyes as she stared at the newspaper. Picking mine up to see what had set her off so badly, the first thing I saw was the front page headline: 8 corpses found inside local gas station's holding tank. At 6 p.m. last night, police officials received a call from a local mechanic, stating that he had found what looks like human remains inside of a customer's gas tank. Upon further investigation, authorities found 8 human bodies in one of the gas station's underground holding tanks. The names of the deceased have not yet been released, but among the bodies were 4 women of various ages, 3 older men, and a small girl, no more than 3 or 4 years old. Something about lengthy rural drives used to always relax me. The desolation of the 2-lane roads that cut through the southwestern high desert are really unparalleled. It's beautiful, the long stretches of roads where the only visible light is coming from your brights, where you feel as if there is an ominous presence, something malicious, constantly lurking in the isolated desert highways. It was March of 2009, and I'm driving from Durango to Phoenix. I left my ski vacation early, as my girlfriend in Phoenix wanted me home. This also meant I had to leave Durango at around 7 p.m. Being young and naive, I drank a few energy drinks, bought a pack of cigarettes, some Chex Mix, and I figured I could make it to Phoenix without any issues. A late-season ice storm made travel impossible on the I-160, so I decided to cut my losses and take a slightly longer route that involved cutting through northwestern New Mexico. As civilization faded and headlights on the other side of the road became a distant memory, it began to snow hard. There was really an eerie, off-putting vibe about the 2-lane highway I was on. There wasn't a shred of vegetation in sight, just desolation, pure nothingness. Everything was black, except for the moonlight, shining a dim light on wet snow that was beginning to coat the empty highway. Feeling as if something was off, I decided to put in a Leonard Skinner CD and search for the nearest rest stop. Keep in mind, I was on Navajo off-reservation trust land at the time, and I figured I wouldn't be able to find a place to pull over and take a comfortable crap in 50 or so miles. As the snow grew heavier and my eyes warier, my brights shone upon a small weathered sign that read, "Rest Stop, Indian Service Route 5, 2 miles. Fuck yes, I thought. 2 miles and 4 minutes later, I parked my Jeep Cherokee next to a dilapidated building made of concrete. The building itself sent shivers down my spine. Not because rest stops are nasty, but because the building generally just rubbed me wrong. I told myself to grow some balls. I put on the emergency brake and walked into the rest stop. It had both men and women restrooms. I walked into the men's, which reeked of sulfur. I attributed it to the fact that it was a bathroom, and found one of 2 stalls. My unease only grew when I realized there weren't any lights. I debated getting back in my car and holding it, but I decided against it. Only rest stop in the area, I figured. I looked for a light switch but gave up, as it seemed futile. I opened up a stall and turned on my BlackBerry's camera as a flashlight. As I was finishing up, I became paralyzed with fear. The lights turned on. I didn't hear a light switch, nor did I see one, but lights just turned on, out of nowhere. It was the most abrupt, heart-stopping thing I've experienced. I sat still, making an effort to not breathe noticeably. I was creeped out beyond belief. That's when I heard the footsteps. They almost sounded like a pair of hooves, just softly making their way through the restroom. Then I heard the breathing. A guttural, loud, animalistic breathing that seemed to be coming from right outside my stall. I heard the footsteps and the breathing, but I didn't see anything. Nothing. Minutes passed, and the breathing came to a halt. My heart having almost stopped at least 6 times in those 6 minutes, finally returned to normal. Regardless, I was certain death awaited me outside the stall door, so I decided to wait it out. That is when I heard the sound of a sink turn on and flowing water for about 20 seconds before it was promptly turned off. More minutes passed, and while the lights remained on, I couldn't hear anything. I decided to man up and check outside the stall. At first glance, there wasn't anything in the bathroom. At a second glance, I realized there weren't even sinks, just small containers of hand sanitizer. Fear set in even deeper, and I knew I was dealing with something truly malevolent, something paranormal. I always considered myself a skeptic, until that earth-shattering moment where I desperately looked for some sinks. Was I going insane? If not, then what the fuck was in the bathroom? These questions I had little time to ponder as I sprinted out of the bathroom and into the frigid, snowy night. I fumbled for my keys and quickly started my car. As the brights turned on, something caught my eye. In a snowbank, standing next to the wall of the building, was some sort of coyote, perched on its hind legs. Its eyes, while not pointed at me, seemed supernatural, absolutely out of this world. My heart pounding, I skidded out of the parking lot, soon driving 50 miles an hour down the icy road. I began to calm down until I glanced in my rearview mirror. The fucker was chasing me on its hind legs. When I say this fucker was fast, it was nearly catching up to a 50-mile-an-hour SUV in a snowstorm. I was scared shitless as I tried to drive faster without flying off the road. Fortunately, I lost whatever it was, but to this day, I've vowed to never drive alone at night again, and to never, under any circumstances, stop at a rest stop in New Mexico. Back in the late 80s, I worked for a U.S. Department of Energy laboratory in the desert of the American Southwest. A set of sprawling cities within cities, the DOE lab complex employs thousands of people, with work ranging from computer science, physics, and chemistry, all the way to important infrastructure jobs like construction or security. I worked on mainframes at the time. Like any secure government facility, this particular complex had a set of colorful local legends that over-dramatized the mysterious work we performed. People were convinced the labs held evidence that aliens had visited us in the 50s, or that we had developed a neutron bomb capable of wiping out cities without destroying any buildings. In reality, the labs were run much like any other company. We had time cards, deadlines, and department meetings, just like everybody else. Despite the reality of mundane lab work, or perhaps because of it, staff often got a kick out of perpetuating these myths. I was once asked on a lunch break if I'd ever been to the flying saucer hangar. "Which one?" I replied. "We've got our own fleet." More interesting and often much more dark were the stories that circulated between scientists and lab staff within the walls of the complex. One such rumor stated that physicists had briefly made contact with humans from the distant future, and that the transmission was IBD. Interesting but disturbing. Another popular rumor was that we created a biological agent so virulent that the labs had been forced to quarantine an entire building, raze it to the ground, and bury the rubble in the desert, along with its deceased inhabitants. But my favorite story, Buttonhead is watching you. In those days, the halls of every building were plastered with information security awareness posters, usually featuring a red-faced villain wearing a trench coat. Beware of your adversary. Protect your secrets. The enemy is always watching. Always dispose of sensitive documents in a burn bag. It's likely that Buttonhead was a mishmash of popular alien myths and the pervasive atmosphere of Cold War paranoia, and represented the idea of an insider threat. The Buttonhead legend went something like this. When working late at night, be on the watch for Buttonhead, who prowls the laboratory halls after sundown. He can only get you when you're alone. He doesn't have a mouth to speak or ears to hear, but his eyes do more than see, and he's always watching. Buttonhead looked like a person from far away, but had a featureless, roundish head with a pair of deep holes in the center of his face. Nobody ever said what he was watching for, or what he would do if he ever caught you alone. It was typically the older lab veterans who would talk about Buttonhead, along with hushed stories about the mysterious disappearance of several night owl employees over the years. During a retirement party, I jokingly asked the guest of honor if he'd ever seen Buttonhead. "I saw it once, in one of the old warehouses way south of the tech area," he replied, cracking a forced smile. "I remember the smell most of all." "So was he an alien, or just a regular old ghost?" I asked. The smile quickly drained away. He paused, looking like he might confess something important, but stopped short of it, muttering, "No, it's much worse than that." A few months later, I was pulling a late night in one of our mainframe rooms, performing some maintenance with a coworker, a contractor named Gary. Gary, a bald, pudgy diabetic Mormon, was a salt-of-the-earth type with an easygoing demeanor. He had an abbreviated sense of humor, but didn't have a mean bone in his body. The mainframe room was in the largest single-story building in the complex, with around 20 crisscrossing halls that seemed to stretch on to infinity. After working hours, most of these halls would fall pitch dark. Hall D, our mainframe hall, was still lit, but every other hall was a catacomb tunnel, with only the faint glow of the occasional vending machine to illuminate the faraway corners of the building. The mainframe computer room itself was large, but was stuffed with IBM systems and noisy fridge-sized cooling units. It wasn't feng shui or anything, but we loved playing around with computers so much that we didn't mind. At around 9 or 10 that night, Gary left the room for a bio break, leaving me alone at my terminal. 30 minutes later, the lights flickered off. This was a frequent occurrence in the aging building, which was why we all carried flashlights. I noticed that Gary hadn't returned from the men's room, and as I felt the call of nature myself, I grabbed my Ever-Ready and headed out the door to check things out. That's when I first noticed the smell. I tell people it smelled like mint gum and roach poison, but there was an indescribable and subtle sickness to it. I've never smelled anything like it since. It was the scent of something horribly unclean and unnatural, combined with a potent artificial sweetness. I hurried toward the men's room, which was 2 darkened hallways over. I made it 5 paces when I saw him, or it. Standing in front of the exit doors at the far end of Hall D was what looked like a man, wearing a gray jumpsuit. Both it and I remained motionless as I trained my light down the hall. Seconds later, it broke into a speed walk straight for me. It was still a few hundred feet away, but I could tell something was clearly wrong by the way it walked. It had an impossibly fast gait, like people from old newsreel clips, and by its head, which looked like an enlarged lumpy orb. When its face came into view, I sprinted back into the mainframe room, which thankfully had a mechanical push-button lock. The face was utterly unrecognizable. It was just a scattered set of abscesses and holes. After slamming the door shut and backing up against the desks, a figure appeared in the small frosted safety window. It was quiet for a moment, and then it spoke.
It's Gary. Let me in. I just saw something.
I couldn't hear it perfectly over the drone of the fans, but something wasn't right about the voice. It sounded like Gary, but as if he were leading some sort of spoken word chant with dozens of other voices. It instantly dawned on me that Gary knew the combination to the lock. I was paralyzed with fear and didn't respond. At this point, the smell was so strong that it almost hurt to breathe. It spoke again.
It's Gary. Let me in. I just saw something.
It sounded like an identical recording of what I'd heard seconds ago. My heart sunk when I realized that there weren't any other exits to the room. I backed up toward the machines, quietly hoping that the thing would leave and that the lights would come back on. A deep buzzing sound came from the other side of the door, followed by more words from the thing in the hall.
Hello? Honey?
The voice had the muffled pitch of a telephone receiver, but it was clearly my wife. It sounded like she was at home.
Hun, is that you? Is everything okay?
I was in a state of confusion, despair, and shock. I summoned the courage to approach the door, aiming my light through the window. "The police have been notified," I yelled. This was impossible, as the mainframe room wasn't technically office space, and thus had no phone. Then I heard something. It sounded like liquid being sucked up through a novelty straw, and then a splattering sound. A thick, white fluid slowly spilled out onto the vinyl tile from underneath the door. The smell was nearly unbearable. I began yelling for help. I could hear the thing fumbling with the push-button lock. The splattering continued, and the dense, white syrup continued pouring in from beneath the door. I remember retreating to the back corner of the mainframe room, and then nothing else. Hours later, a pair of MPs found me curled up in a ball and sopping wet in the rear corner of the mainframe room. My wife, who had received a call at 10:30 from someone she believed to be me, called the base police at midnight after I didn't return home. The guards didn't find any sign of forced entry, and there was no sign of Gary or the white liquid. The next morning, my manager told me that Gary had terminated his contract earlier that week and wasn't even scheduled to come in that day. I never saw him again. My wife and I moved to California a month later. Even though I work from home these days, my pulse still quickens when I walk down a dark hallway. What stays with me the most is that strange, awful smell. It's probably my brain just playing tricks, but I swear, it still wafts in through my window some nights. Hey guys and ladies, thanks for watching. If you want me to tell your story or read a creepypasta, email me at the address in the description. Be good to animals.
Oh yeah!
Hey, what the hell are you doing, man?
Oh yeah!
No, not oh yeah. You just destroyed my fucking wall.
Oh.
Look at this place. Who's gonna pay for this? And what the hell are you smiling about? I'm gonna sue the shit out of you, you red asshole.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. I'm gonna call my lawyer right now. So get the hell out of here. I'll see you in court. Not that way. The way you came in. What the hell's wrong with you? Actually, before you go, could I have a couple squirts of that?
Yeah.
Ah, I appreciate it. Now scram, you big barrel ass. And don't come around here anymore. Hey, I need to talk to Tony right now. Tony, if a giant pitcher destroyed my living room wall, are the odds good that I'll win in court?
They're great!
Cool. Be good to animals, even people. See ya.
Ja, snämmar, bergsbus, rish.
I remember the smell. I remember the smell most of all. God damn it.